Kevin Sanders joining us, nuclear expert. Thanks for being with us. With such an overwhelming disaster with so many different facets, where do you draw the line of them simply being incapable of dealing with such a large-scale disaster and their actual errors, the mistakes that they are making?
Well, first, Gus, I don't think that you can expect government to admit error or to suggest that there's absolutely nothing that can be done and simply throw up their hands and walk away and saying that there's nothing that they can do. They must at least attempt or even pretend to be doing something. I think in terms of taking notice of what they're saying, what they're reporting, what the official statements are, it's best simply to not disregard them, but to be aware that almost the entire history of the nuclear industry around the world has shown that whenever anything goes wrong, first, the general failure to report it at all if they can avoid letting anyone know that something's gone wrong. And we're seeing this now. As recently as a few hours ago, the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, generally a very sympathetic element in the picture. In many ways, it is almost a public relations arm for the nuclear industry. And yet, even now, the International Atomic Energy Agency has found it necessary to call on the Japanese government to be more open and to be more honest. Whatever we're hearing, the truth is probably worse.
You know, we're hearing about level 4 and then Japan increasing the risk to level 5 and France saying one thing and the IAEA saying another. Can you break down to us what it is that all this technicality is talking about and what kind of consequences this kind of risk could have?
Well, by putting numbers on it as specifically as they do, they enhance the impression that they know what's going on and that they have some measuring or quantitative way of assessing what the situation is. These are, I'm not saying fanciful numbers, but they're possibly irrelevant in this situation. First of all, because we can't trust the source on these numbers. We can't necessarily trust the measuring devices anymore. Guesswork is operating here in this situation at all levels. So it's almost impossible to answer any kind of specific question on this. The result of this is that the whole world now is watching these appalling scenes. The impact of this is already being felt all around the world in the sense that people in practically all countries with nuclear reactors are reconsidering the wisdom of continuing with nuclear reactor production, and there's a call now for the closing down of reactors all over the world. And here in New York, where I'm speaking now, there is a move already to close down Indian Point, a reactor which is only 25 miles from New York. And people are talking about what would happen if we had to evacuate New York. We see the problems now demonstrated in Japan, the impossibility of dealing with this situation. Indian Point, the oldest reactor in the United States, 50 years old, ready to be decommissioned in a year or so, and sitting on what is now known to be a serious earthquake fault overdue for a rumble. So there's real fear here. And all around the world, I think it's the end of the nuclear power industry as we have known it. I can't think anybody will build any more nuclear reactors, even if this situation does not go to the worst possible situation, which would be 3 or 4 Chernobyls all happening at the same time. And that's not impossible. But the mere fear of this is such that it has jolted the world into a realization of how serious the problem can be and how ill-advised the whole idea of nuclear power running on uranium has been. These images are burned into human memory now, and I think that 100 years from now we'll look back and wonder why on earth we ever built such an insane arrangement, boiling water with nuclear power. As Ralph Nader has said, it's a dumb way to boil water, and indeed it is. And he also said that after Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island, one more nuclear reactor, it's the end of the nuclear power industry. And I think that broadly is the situation. I think that we'll see a rapid reassessment, the closing down of all the older reactors, and cancellations of all those that have been ordered.
Yeah, and Kevin Sanders, just at this point, if I may I do apologise for cutting in, just because we have our correspondent on the line from Tokyo again. Do stay with us. Let me get an update from the ground and then come back to you for some more assessment. Michael Penn is with us now. What is the latest on the ground that you can tell us?
Well, obviously there's still some radiation escaping from the plants. We're not exactly sure how much at this point. It looks like, the situation is they're barely managing to continue efforts to keep it under control, but so far those efforts don't seem to have done very well.
And from the sense of the citizens that you're getting in Tokyo, what are they saying about the situation as it unfolds?
Well, in Tokyo there's a lot of fear, and the government is trying to calm that fear to the extent which they can. But really, for example, particularly foreigners have left the country. A lot of them have, and a lot who haven't left are debating whether they should. Parents and loved ones are sort of encouraging them to get out of Japan before they get radiated. But on the other hand, other people continue to stay here and do their work. And the Japanese themselves are trying to, salvage some sense of normality out of a very abnormal situation.
Okay, Michael Penn there in Tokyo, many thanks. And let's cross over back again to Kevin Sanders, nuclear expert in New York. What kind of long-term consequences, if we could go back to Japan, might the communities living near the nuclear power plant face? Because we are told that when it comes to this kind of radiation, it might not be those immediate effects, but the long-term effects that will actually show how devastating this accident has actually been.
Yes, one of the problems of demonstrating how serious the problem is the problems are so delayed. In addition to the immediate problems of rashes and skin burning, there's a more serious problem. The thyroid damage, particularly to young people, particularly to children, becomes evident in the coming years. And then in future years, problems of birth deformities, because this radiation is not only carcinogenic, it's mutagenic. It results in the deformities, the destruction of the human DNA. What we're seeing with radiation is human harm to human DNA, to human genetic structure. This is new in human experience. And I think that people are going to start becoming much more aware of it than they've been allowed to know since the early days of nuclear power, when it was said it would be too cheap to meter, that it was clean, it was harmless, and it would somehow redeem the horror of the nuclear bombs. Well, it is a horror of its own kind, just the radiation. Well, here's where you can't trust officials. The official report, even by the United Nations IAEA, the official report is that only 24 people died at Chernobyl. In fact, the figure is into the tens of thousands, and it continues as the long-term impacts of that disaster become known.
Well, isn't the problems with getting, for example, the figures, for example, in Chernobyl, was that, as time goes on, it's harder to connect directly the nuclear accident with the impact or the deaths that are taking place?
Yes, like cigarette smoking. In the worst-case scenario of a Chernobyl-like disaster, just as in Chernobyl, the deaths will run into the thousands or tens of thousands, but not immediately. Some will die immediately. Those exposed to intense exposure, the people who in fact now are working on the scene, those heroic people who are still trying to take control of this. It's virtually a suicide mission, and they know it, and so one can only salute their courage. In the event of a meltdown, illnesses and deaths will run into the tens of thousands, and vast areas will be rendered uninhabitable. The land, the crops, much of the sustenance of life will be permanently damaged.
When we're looking, though, of course, when we're looking at a disaster like this, it is devastating. It is terrible to see this loss of life and this kind of fallout. But how does nuclear energy compare to the other forms of energy that we have?
Well, it is, in one sense, more dangerous than any other energy source that's ever been developed. In practically all countries, The nuclear industry depends on huge government insurance to get financial support for the nuclear industry, because the economics don't make any sense anymore. It is possible to continue only with government-guaranteed insurance, which means that the taxpayers are paying. That has to be calculated into the cost of energy. So it is by no means the most efficient, it is by no means the cheapest. And of course, as we're seeing now, when something goes wrong, the implications of it are overwhelming and horrifying. What to do now is a very real problem in terms of providing the world's energy, because countries like Japan and France and others have become increasingly dependent upon this as a source of energy. Have waste that lasts thousands or tens of thousands of years. The waste problem is another factor that has to be calculated into this. We've been very bad ancestors. We have left our offspring for generations to come, for thousands of years to come, to look after the wastes that we've left. Any generation that leaves the future generations the disposal of atomic waste has really earned the contempt of history.
The other big story of today, which is of course the protests that are going on in the Arab world, but just looking at the energy aspect of it, because of course many of the countries are big suppliers of oil, and probably many countries, especially in Europe, who are looking at the crises in countries like Libya or Bahrain and wondering whether, you know, access to oil is going to become more difficult in the next maybe even couple of years. They were probably, do you think, looking at nuclear energy as something they wanted to invest more in. Do you think the assessment of that will change now?
Well, the convergence of the two problems now, the fact that so much of the world has become dependent upon oil, and now we're discovering certain aspects of oil and the whole carbon-based fuel cycle that are representing problems that had not been considered. It's a particularly dirty kind of power, although coal and oil, they're dirty, they're ugly, they cause pollution and they kill people. They're still better than what we're seeing now in Japan. It's a lack of foresight. The world, when it went into its commitment to coal and oil, the thought was that, well, the supply is limitless, so we'll just use it forever. Well, that's not happened. Also, there are political problems. You know, if a country that has most of the world's oil suddenly becomes a scene of chaos and the oil is unavailable, the whole world suddenly is facing an economic crisis. We've got ourselves, we the species, have got ourselves into a real mess with our dependence on energy. So I think one of the things that will follow will be a really sustained scientific, almost a Manhattan project, as it were, to find some other sources of energy that are clean and safe and renewable. And the pressure to do that, which has, by the way, the oil industry and then later the nuclear industry together have fought in ways that are sometimes illegal. They have sought to suppress the development of all sorts of alternative energy systems that were available, that could have been explored, should have been explored. The result of these tragedies and the problems with oil are now becoming so obvious that the pressure for human ingenuity to be brought to bear on finding some more sensible way of powering our civilization is going to lead to at least some improvements in that area.
Okay, Kevin Sanders, nuclear expert in New York. Thanks for staying with us.